All aboard! Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, football fans of all ages, I am Beast Mike, and you have now arrived at my train of thought. It's also time to ask the question, where do we go from here? If there was one word I could use to describe these two teams that I'm going to talk about today, it's frustrating. For several different reasons. Not just for record, not just because of really good talent that's getting kind of wasted, but overall, the grand scheme of things for these two teams. Atlanta and Denver, the Super Bowl 33 matchup. Denver won that easily, but Atlanta's going to go first here. My award for most frustrating team in the 2023 season easily goes to the Atlanta Falcons. There are so many reasons why. Let's talk about it. Atlanta had 5 losses that are head-scratching, mind-numbing, and they will jar your brain. For if Atlanta even wins 3 of them, they win the division, and they're the ones hosting the Eagles in the wildcard round. Let's talk about the losses in question. You lost at home to the Commanders, which is pretty bad. Losing to the Commanders at all became a terrible thing, and they ended up losing to them at home. You lose to the Titans and get carved up by Will Levis in his first true start. That's a pretty bad look. You lose to Josh Dobbs, who literally just got off the rocket ship, or the plane, if you will, and he had to come in and save the Vikings bacon. And he actually did it. The next week, you lose to Kyler Murray in his first game back. Mind you, these 4 losses happened in 5 games. They actually beat Tampa Bay, that's the other game in question. And these losses happened all in the span of a month, mind you. At least Atlanta was not frustrating for the following few weeks. And then right before Christmas, on the 17th of December, they have their last really crippling, devastating loss and getting beat by the Panthers. Part of this is Desmond Ridder, but we're going to talk about him in a little bit. Getting pummeled and humiliated by the Saints and getting laughed at and taunted by Jameis and really kind of trolled hard by Jameis, that's kind of like the icing on the cake here. But again, we're going to talk about Arthur Smith in a little bit. Let's get to Ridder first. And an eternally frustrating quarterback and an eternally frustrating season. We kind of knew that Atlanta needed to go quarterback here, get a new QB in there, because Ridder just wasn't it. He can run the ball, obviously. His passing ability isn't that great, but was really frustrating were the red zone turnovers. You can almost bank on it half the time that Ridder's going to make a terrible decision, and it's going to be an NO, and that's going to be the end of a Falcon drive that deserved points, but got none and had to like it. Why'd they lose that Carolina game? Well, Atlanta was driving and going for the kill, and then Ridder throws a back-breaking NO. Atlanta never saw the ball again. Carolina drove down the field, burning the clock in the process for the game-winning field goal, and that loss kind of put any sort of kibosh that the Falcons remotely had before getting stomped in by New Orleans at the end of the season. Desmond Ridder had 12 touchdowns and 12 NOs passing this year, and needless to say, it feels like his time as a starting QB is coming to an end. To be honest, I'm still shocked that they didn't make a move at all to get Lamar Jackson. Obviously more on him when I get to the Ravens, but that's not for today. What is for today is the Falcons' ability to run the ball. They do it well. We knew this. Tyler Algier was a really good running back in his rookie year in 2022. Bijan Robinson was also a very good running back in his rookie year last year. Now, Algier actually had a better year in terms of getting yards than Bijan did, but the explosiveness and the all-around ability and talent that Bijan has just can't be denied. He's a really good player. I still don't know if Atlanta should have picked him over Jalen Carter, but that's the move they made. Bijan had 11 total touchdowns this year, 7 rushing, 4 receiving. He almost had 1,000 yards. He was 24 yards short. Algier did have a pretty good year as an RB too, at 600-plus yards in his own right. So their 1-2 punch has some thunder and some lightning added to it. I think we can roll with that. The Falcons are a top 10 rushing team this past season. And it felt like the receivers finally got some usage. We got to see more Drake London this year. He had 900 yards. He played in 16 of 17 games. Kyle Pitts played all 17 games. He had a little under 700 yards. Both guys got in where they fit in, but only 2 touchdowns. I think part of that may be because of the guys throwing them the ball is one thing for London, and Pitts actually had 3, which is probably 3 more than fantasy owners were expecting from Kyle Pitts this past year. But I think a better quarterback would make these guys better. honestly. I don't think it's really on them. I think their talent is very evident. It's just, you got to get somebody that can competently throw you a football, to me. Jonnu Smith's not a Falcon anymore. He had a decent year, to his credit. He almost had 600 yards in his own right and 3 scores. Bijan Robinson, like I mentioned, had 4 touchdowns receiving and almost had 500 yards in that realm. So there is some talent here. Not obviously, Jonnu Smith's not a Falcon anymore, but there is some talent on this team. This is a really good offensive line led by Chris Lindstrom and company. Atlanta's got decent talent. And then there's the defense, where it's a mixed bag. You have some really alarming things. The most sacks anybody got was 6.5. Calais Campbell did that. But Atlanta, to be fair to them, had 3 guys with 6.5, or 3 guys with 6 at least. But Dupree had 6.5, and Arnold Ebiketie, who I do want to see take another step forward, and I do think he can, he had 6. They got some decent sack numbers from other players involved here. Like Ellis had 4, and Omimata had 4. It's not bad, but I think Atlanta could do a little bit more with a headlining edge rusher. I'd like to see them at least get that. There's also some good news and bad news to think about when it comes to this Falcons team. Jesse Bates was worth every penny the Falcons paid him. He was incredible. 132 tackles led the team. 6 NOs led the team. He had an amazing season. Obviously, the signature highlight being the coast-to-coast pick 6 he had against the Saints. Unfortunately, that was 6 of the 8 NOs Atlanta had as a team. The other 2 were by Richie Grant and by Nate Landman, who was a linebacker. Grant's a safety. So to say that Atlanta needs way more playmaking on the defensive side of the ball and way more of an ability to take the ball away from the offensive opponents, I think is an understatement. The Falcons defense as a whole wasn't terrible. It just wasn't opportunistic. And I think that's what really helped sink the Falcons' chances against teams who could actually move the ball up and down the field on them. And then there's Mr. 7 and 10, also known as Arthur Smith, basically the new age Jeff Fisher. Or at least this decade's Jeff Fisher. Remember, Mr. 7 and 9 was kind of that with the Rams and Titans in the 2010s. Well, Arthur Smith has certainly taken that baton and has stepped it up into the 2020s. Well, at least he did until he got fired from his job after getting destroyed by those New Orleans Saints. He's now in Pittsburgh as the OC. Will Jonnu Smith follow him, or will Arthur Smith kind of utilize Pat Frymuth or Washington from Georgia as the Jonnu Smith role? We'll see. Anyway, Atlanta now brings in a new coach in Raheem Morris, and I do like him. I think Raheem Morris is a really good D coordinator. We'll see him, I think, utilize this Falcons team and this Falcon defense. I think they're going to be pretty good once they get some more pieces. How about the offense? Zach Robinson, like Morris before him, will also be coming from Los Angeles. The Rams had a very good season, and I think a year that nobody saw coming, where the Rams' daycare center of a defense actually played really well. Their pass defense was a little questionable, but they could get to the quarterback. They also had Aaron Donald, who's the best defensive player in our generation, but aside from him, they were able to get to the quarterback with a bunch of kids. I think Morris will do well on the defensive side of the ball. Meanwhile, the offensive side, with Robinson, who was the passing game coordinator and quarterbacks coach, he was helping Matt Stafford handle business and has been there the last few years. He was the quarterbacks coach for 4 years, including obviously the Super Bowl team the Rams had. Maybe this is another McVay type of disciple, which is still the offensive trend of the year. It's anybody who was under the learning tree of Sean McVay or coached alongside him in some way, shape, form, or fashion seems to get jobs in the NFL now. That's kind of how things work, apparently. Falcons do have some notable free agents to pay attention to. I already mentioned Jonnu Smith, and I think he's going to be a pretty good, solid tight end somewhere. Jeff Okudah was a 3rd overall pick once upon a time, and he's never really gotten out of the blocks as an NFL corner. He is a free agent as well. Calais Campbell, who I mentioned led the team in sacks this past year. Very stable, very sturdy, very productive defensive tackle. He too can get money, or defensive end, depending on your system. One of the great returners of our time, and Cordell Patterson. He also is a free agent, and it felt like the writing was on the wall once the Falcons drafted Bijan, and Cordell Patterson's time in Atlanta may perhaps be coming to an end. We'll see. And, of course, Bud Dupree, who had a pretty solid year with 6 sacks, he, too, is on the open market. Atlanta's in a pretty good spot, I would say, when it comes to their finances. They are 13th in the league with about $41.6 million. So Atlanta's got some really good opportunity to bolster their roster. They also have the 8th pick in the draft to go along with it. And it's a very good offensive class, so I think Atlanta could go to work here. Or could Atlanta draft that superstar edge rusher they truly need? The Falcons have their own pick in round 2. They have their own pick in round 3. And they also have a day 2 pick from Jacksonville. That's to be determined from a prior trade. It could be a 2nd or 3rd round pick. We'll see how that goes. They have their own picks in rounds 4 and 5. And then round 6, they do have a pick, but it's Cleveland. It's not theirs. They don't have any round 7s. The Falcons are eternally frustrating every year almost. From the falconing, when it comes to them blowing leads at an incredibly amazing rate, to just losing games they have no business losing, Atlanta seems to always be eternally painful to watch when it comes to giving people headaches. Well, outside of Charlotte, Tampa Bay, or New Orleans. Can Atlanta get out of their own way? I think that's the real key here. And then there are the Broncos. If ever there were a number that may describe the Denver Broncos season, it's the number 7. It doesn't have that much to do with Elway per se, but the number 7 seems pretty vital to the Denver Broncos season. Let's talk about how. 772. That's as many yards as Cortland Sutton had. He had a really good year. He had 10 touchdowns this year and was probably the most likely to make a spectacular catch in the NFL. 774. That's the amount of rushing yards Javonte Williams had. He's still a bulldozer. I'm amazed he only scored twice, but he's a really nice bulldozer of a running back, and he seems to handle his business in that regard. 7 wins for Russell Wilson. Yes, Russell Wilson had 7 wins for the Broncos this past season before he was unceremoniously benched after another Christmas humiliation by the Patriots, who somehow ended up beating Denver and effectively ending any Broncos' chances of making the playoffs before Denver ended up winning their Week 7 team game against the Chargers. 7 going on 8 years. That's how long it took for the Broncos to beat the Chiefs. And yet they were finally able to do so. They ended up playing Taylor Swift's Shake It Off after the game, which was a hilarious troll job. I appreciate the pettiness by the Denver PA team or sound system team, producer team, whoever decided to play the Taylor Swift track after the Kansas City had to hold that out. And 70. Yep, that's the amount of points Denver gave up in Week 3 against the Dolphins. 726 yards were also given up in that game by the Broncos, and it could have been 73 points that Denver had given up had Miami decided to go for the field goal and tie, which was the most amount of points in NFL history. It was the greatest offensive day in NFL history, but at least Denver will not go in the record books for giving up the most points ever. It was the best of times and the worst of times for the Broncos, I would say. They went a month where they won 5 straight and had 4 of those wins against playoff teams. I just mentioned the worst of times. They also got humiliated by losing to Nate Hackett, who was a terrible coach for the Broncos in 2022, as he was on the staff for the Jets. They also lost to the Commanders. They got beat by the Raiders twice. This was not a boring season, I would say, for the Broncos, but it was also a frustrating one, which in itself is kind of painful. The only really non-frustrating things that happened with Denver was probably, I'd say, beating the Browns, considering Cleveland's quarterback situation, the way they lost to Houston, because the Houston's a pretty good team, and getting blown out by the Lions, who were a very good team. I guess that's pretty much it when it came to Denver's frustrations. Jeffrey Simmons did have 3 NLs this year. He's a very good safety, and he's also really entertaining to watch, considering he could do a whole lot of everything. As great as PS2 is, I'm amazed he only had 1 NL this past year. It is kind of shocking. Maybe part of that's because people just don't throw it towards him, but PS2 not being more opportunistic when he does get the ball thrown towards him is a little surprising. I would imagine he's going to have more when the quarterbacks are going to throw it at him a little bit more often. I'd have to think that's the case. Alex Singleton had a crazy year when it came to tackling. 177 tackles, which basically gives him the bronze medal in that particular stat. He was just 6 shy of the tackling leader, which is Bobby Wagner, ironically, in Seattle. Denver's relationship with the Seahawks seems to be kind of love-hate, but Seattle will deal with on another time. Jonathan Cooper and Nick Bonito. Maybe the pass rush duo for the future of the Broncos. Cooper had 8.5 sacks, Bonito 8. And maybe there's a little bit of this is just the beginning of things to come for those two guys. Maybe Denver might have their pass rushing combo of the future. In either case, they may be the most underrated pass rushing combo in the league. So I'll give them that. Denver doesn't have too many free agents to really worry about. The biggest one's probably Josie Jewell, who seems to be a very stable, sturdy inside linebacker. I think he could play in most 3-4 schemes and maybe even 4-3 ones. I've always liked him. Pretty solid player. Their other big free agents I would imagine would probably be like Adam Troutman, who got considerable time as their tight end. I think he's a decent player as well. Will Denver bring him back? I think Denver absolutely needs to get more explosive in terms of their receiver core, not just at tight end, but at the wide receiver room. I like Jerry Jeudy, but it feels like they don't like Jerry Jeudy. Can he take a step forward finally in what could be his final year as a Bronco going forward? Only time will tell there. Mike Purcell's a free agent, pretty solid player. So is Will Lutz, who's a pretty good kicker. They are free agents and could seek work elsewhere if they so choose. Denver's cap situation for a team that kind of needs to take a step forward and is kind of in that no man's land is not great. They are 29th in cap space. The only 3 teams worse than them, the Chargers, the Dolphins, and the Bills. They are $19.2 million over the cap, even with the extra cap room that everybody got. But as I just mentioned, the Broncos don't have too many free agents to truly worry about. So they're in a decent spot here. A couple restructures, which will probably start with the inevitable cutting of Russell Wilson, which will bring them cap relief on June 1st, presumably, especially. I think Denver will be just fine when it comes to their cap situation. Let's get to their draft picks, though. The Broncos do have their first round pick after 2 years of not having it, and they will pick 12th. Denver could go a lot of different ways. In theory, they'll go quarterback because it looks like Russell Wilson's time as a Bronco is up. Denver could also get more explosive when it comes to their receiving core. They could also get more explosive at tight end, but Brock Bowers isn't going to fall to them. This could be a sneaky good tight end class, though. There's a lot of pretty good tight ends that can go get the ball. Fortunately for them, they do not have a second-round pick to make this happen based off of prior trades. They do have a third. They have a fourth from the Bradley Chubb trade. That was Miami's pick. They have a fifth from the Jets. They have their own fifth, and they have a 7th-round pick from the Rams. Does Denver trade down? Maybe all the quarterbacks are gone, and the Broncos are kind of in limbo there, so it's time to re-up and get picks. Does Denver trade down? Does Denver stay where they are and get a QB or wide receiver? What does Denver do? And what about the elephant in the room here? Sean Payton clearly isn't my way or highway coach. He clearly wants things differently, and it was oil and water for him to mix with Russell Wilson. This feels like a big year for him. And if he does not do well in year 2 in Denver, I think the microscope is going to be shined upon him. Is he a bit of a made man because of a Super Bowl in New Orleans? Sure. But people are going to look at him a little funny if the Broncos can't get anywhere past 8-9 like they were this past year in a season where the Chiefs were down and the Raiders had so much turmoil and the Chargers pretty much cratered to the center of the earth. Can Sean Payton get it right now that the Raiders look like they're stable and the Chargers have Harbaugh and Kansas City are still the tribal chiefs? Only time will tell. I mentioned the Raiders a couple of times in the last 30 seconds. I'm going to mention them a lot more in the next version of this video. The NFC team I'm going to talk about, the Chicago Bears. They might have something that the Falcons want. You have now reached the final stop of my train of thoughts, and the next train will start in Chicago. So for the Bears and the Raiders, there is still one question I will have to ask. Where do they go from here?